Welcome to another episode of On the Issues with Alon Ben-Meir. Today's guest is David Rabinowitz, a retired academic psychiatrist previously working as director of ambulatory mental health services in the Division of Psychiatry at Rambam Medical Campus in Haifa, Israel. Outside of the mental health field, his main interest is the political psychology of the Israel-Palestine conflict. In this episode, Alon and David discuss the Israeli perspective toward the current war with Iran, including the people's fears and anxieties, how Netanyahu has over the past 20 years shaped the Israeli public mindset and worldview, and the political psychology of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Good evening, David. In Israel today it's about, 6 o'clock?
No, it's actually about 5 o'clock now,
Oh,
five
it's
o'clock
only
in the
5
afternoon.
o'clock. Okay, that's great. Yeah. Well, I am so delighted to see you. Last time seeing you has been a while. And seeing you under these circumstances, in a way it is exciting, and in a way it is sad. But it's a reality that we have to live with. And hope
Indeed.
the next time when we get together, we can talk about peace and security and prosperity instead of the horrific wars that have been taking place since October 7. It seemed to me that it has not stopped. So, given that it is a live podcast, David, and you are in a war zone as we speak, I would like first to ask you, what is the sentiment? What is going on in Israel? What do you hear from the public? What they are thinking about? What they are talking about? What is the level of anxiety as you see it from your perspective living there?
Well, first of all, let me say it's wonderful to be here with you as well, and I look forward to that. Alon, and I do think I should mention that this is nevertheless a period of war, and there is the possibility of a missile warning. And should we get an alert, then I will have to leave the podcast and move to a protected area until we get the all clear, which is anything between 10 minutes to half an hour. And I do hope that it won't happen, but we need to be aware that it may.
I understand. Thank you. Yes.
Let me address your question by saying that the sentiment in Israel at this time is fairly varied, but I think what needs to be taken into account is that for many, many years, in certain ways, the government of Israel has prepared the population for this war, although not in any direct or obvious way. What is the message that has come across to us all the time? That Iran is an existential threat to Israel. It has publicly stated that it wishes to destroy Israel, and it is building a nuclear arsenal, or let me say it is in the process of preparing to build a nuclear weapon, and of course the missile components, which is frightening and raises, I think, a lot of fear in the population, although not very overt fear, but it's always there. So in a way, this war, then when it broke out, that was the rationale. I think that rationale has largely been internalized, because if you listen to the public discourse through the media and so on, this is there all the time. I mean, people are saying that, that there is an existential danger. We could be wiped out. 20 missiles of 1-ton warhead could wipe out half of Tel Aviv. So people seem to have internalized that message. So be that as it may, what they've also internalized is the home front messages. And I think that this has provided a certain amount of, I wouldn't go so far as to say confidence, but the capacity to handle the situation. Everyone knows, it's on everyone's lips. You hear it in the public discourse, that when there's a siren, you go to the protected room and it saves lives. And in point of fact, I think that the Israeli population in this respect has become fairly well disciplined, and we are made familiar. I don't think that, if a missile was to, for example, yesterday or the past couple of days, a very large missile with a very large warhead hit in a small southern city in Israel with a lot of damage, a lot of injuries. And nevertheless, everyone, the sort of dominant content was those that were in the protected room were safe. So in that sense, that simple message is a way of giving the population a tool to manage the anxiety. So in that sense, I personally do not sense a dominant public feel of raised levels of anxiety and panic. I don't feel that. I think that people are calm, expectant, and do show some resilience. I would have to add to that it is those in the north that suffer the most in this respect, because the Hezbollah in the north are also attacking the north with smaller weapons, anti-tank type weapons, which give a warning time of anything between six seconds and maybe 1 minute. So there's a lot more fear and anxiety and concern in the north. So that is more or less how I would describe the situation at the moment.
Yeah, if I may, David, you know, Netanyahu has been in power continuously almost 20 years now.
Yes.
And he has been, his customary for him to inflame, to amplify, I should say, the threat from Iran.
Yes.
I know that Iran has been pursuing, it's going to continue to pursue potentially to a nuclear weapon. But we also know one thing, and just so that we put the thing in the proper context. Some say that if Iran is to acquire a nuclear weapon, it's going to wipe up Israel. Well,
Yes.
I don't buy into that argument at all. And I don't buy into that argument because if we look historically speaking, since World War II, since the United States attacked Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no two powers, no nuclear powers have waged war against another. That is, the possession of nuclear weapons have served as a deterrence. And Israel obviously is known to have up to 100 warheads, nuclear warheads. And if I were to put myself in the shoe of any Iranian, well, I'm thinking in those terms as well, that we are threatened by an enemy, sworn enemy, Israel, with the nuclear weapons, and we need to defend ourselves. So this is how they look at it. When I speak to them, this is the language that they use. We are the one who are threatened. We are the one who's being attacked. We did not initiate any attack. Of course, we have their own surrogates. They have so-called axis of resistance they've been using against Israel and all of that. But as we see it here, this war, and again, there's American consensus that it was Netanyahu who pushed President Trump to enter this horrific campaign. And 3.5 weeks into this war, there is still no exit strategy. And now the United States are talking, of course, as you well know, the crisis, the oil crisis is a global now. And the danger continue to escalate. So this war, as many people, observers here, commentators saying, should not have happened. It was necessary. There was no imminent threat to the United States, nor was there any imminent threat to Israel. And remember, after the June attack of last year, Trump stated clearly, we have decimated, obliterated Iran nuclear facilities, programs, and all of that. And all of a sudden, now there is a renewed nuclear threat against the United States and Israel. So how do you square that? How do the Israelis look into this? There's this contradictory statements made, and how the Netanyahu, in particular, been brainwashing the Israelis for nearly 2 decades to believe that Iran poses an existential threat. So do a Palestinian state, for that matter.
Yeah, well, okay, that's a complex question. And let me begin by saying, more or less what you said at the end. Yes, it is absolutely true that the Netanyahu government has, I would use the word, engineered the public political discourse, shaped to their worldview, to their mindsets and their worldview quite aggressively. Right now, our general feeling is that if you oppose that worldview, if you say something publicly that opposes the worldview, there's a growing reaction which is of a very worrying kind. Now, let me take to begin with what I said earlier. What I think is that public discourse and how the Netanyahu coalitions have shaped that discourse has been largely internalized by the Israeli public, even to the point, Bartal has made this point in his book, even to the point whereby the Israeli center and left is actually using the concepts that have been injected into the public discourse from the Netanyahu coalition sources. So
right, yes.
your point is very well taken. And I tend to, personally, I say this with a semi-smile on my face, that I think anything said by any politician has to be taken with a certain amount of skepticism. And the real question always is, what does the data say? And here I'm already at a weakness because I don't know all the data. And I dare say that the majority of the average person in the street doesn't know all the data. There are some that do, the scholars, the people like yourself who have excellent sources of understanding the deeper levels of discourse in the political spheres. And of course, everything has to be carefully listened to. So the real issue here is that we don't really know exactly what is right here. As I'm saying, look, again, I'm stressing that the relative calm and resilience in the Israeli public may well be a function of that. But nevertheless, that's the reality of it. Now, to get back to this issue, it's absolutely correct when we look at the data on the ground that although it is, a policy denied by the Israelis that they have any kind of nuclear weapons, they preserve this what they like to call, I think, constructive ambiguity about it.
That's right.
But I think there's an understanding just in the everyday sense that Israel certainly does have a nuclear capacity. I think we need to go, though, beyond that and ask ourselves, what is the purpose of that nuclear capacity? I ask myself, for example, what would be the purpose of the nuclear capacity that Israel has, and what would be the purpose of the nuclear capacity that Iran may have or is working towards? And therein lies, I think, looking at the issue of purpose, the goals, it has to be taken into account in this discourse. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I mean, we know that the nuclear doctrine is a deterrence, a mutual deterrence.
Yes.
This has been in existence since going back since the end of World War II. Mutual deterrence has been the strategy that both all powers with the nuclear weapons have pursued, and the concept of assured mutual destruction. This is really that's exactly the point here. That is, I maintain that even if Iran is to acquire nuclear weapons, it will not dare to attack Israel because it will, Israel has, based on it, I know, second strike capability, nuclear second strike capability that could wipe half of Iran. And so the Iranian knows that only too well. So what they wanted to have, that's what I'm told by many. We need a deterrence. Albeit, they are still saying we are not pursuing a nuclear weapon. It's forbidden by Islam to have this kind of horrific weapon to have, and we are not pursuing it. But we also know Iran would like to have the technical skill, the ability to assemble one at a very quick order, just like Pakistan did after India exploded tested nuclear weapon. Within 3-4 weeks, Pakistan responded to that and tested its own nuclear weapon. This was prepared. So they want to have preparation for that. So what we're seeing here, Netanyahu was the champion. This is Netanyahu is the one who made sure that
Yes,
Trump in his first term withdrew from the Iran deal that Obama orchestrated in
yes,
2018. And every observer who was looking at it saying, if this because of that, Iran is going to be freer to pursue its nuclear program. And as a matter of fact, it did. And today it has 925 kilos of enriched uranium to 60%, which is a small hub to actually weapon-grade
yeah,
uranium. So
yeah,
Iran made a great deal of progress as a result of the fact that Trump withdrew from the original deal. And so, this we can go back and forth, but my point is this: this war has taken place because Netanyahu wanted to have it. Netanyahu has basically been obsessed. He's been obsessed from day one with Iran, going back 20 years, more than 20 years. And that obsession, I think, has led to the disaster that we are witnessing today. And mind you, David, as I see it, what we are witnessing today, the global chaos, it is only beginning. That is, the consequences, this war will have long-term consequences that will be impossible to measure today. It's going to be horrific in so many different ways. So let's leave it there. But I just want to slowly move to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and just connect it for a minute. And
Alon, may I?
I just want your reaction to the following. That is,
Yes, okay.
Israel opposed Netanyahu the creation of Palestinian states.
Yeah.
Throughout my research all of these years, I also know one thing. What is the connection between that and Iran? Had Israel been able or willing to settle the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with Iranian enmity or threat, existential threat at that, would have been persistent? I doubt that. So please go ahead and tell me what you are thinking.
Let me take one step back, if I
Yes.
may, and just comment on what you said. Of course, I have to say in all honesty that I cannot claim expertise to provide any kind of in-depth analysis to your comments. What I have to fall back on is the public discourse, and the public discourse as expressed basically through the mainstream media. I mean, we are exposed to an enormous amount of expert commentary and I do my best to listen to different ideological streams on the television channels. I don't always succeed because it's not that easy, but I must say that I would say one of the dominant views expressed by Israeli analysts that I listen to at any rate on the television is that if Iran had a bomb, they would use it straight away. Now, I make this point not to counter your argument, but to point to something else. That this kind of thing raises fear in the Israeli public. It makes it easier for the public to not necessarily to support the war, but to understand why this war is taking place. This is part of the dominant ethos that Iran is perceived to be more dangerous to Israel than Israel is to Iran, taken before the war. In other words, not at the moment. At the moment,
Yes.
military factors are playing a role. And I would say that that is the dominant thinking at this point in the public discourse. I have to add, though, of course, as I've said, that I already feel that I have insufficient expertise to offer any depth analysis.
Yeah. But then again, it is all the narrative that's been used over these decades
Yes.
against Iran. That is, that the successive Israeli government, specifically under Netanyahu, have been
Yes.
using this narrative in order to convince the Israeli public that the Palestinian pose existential danger, that Iran pose existential danger. And today the whole world is looking at Israel not just as a constructive, as a country, peaceful country, democracy, that want to live in peace and prosper together in the region, but as a bully in the region. It wants to control the entire Middle East. This government openly speak about the Greater Israel. the annexation of land is ongoing in the West Bank, inch by inch, yard by yard. Same thing is happening in Gaza. So you cannot possibly trust this government whatever they're saying is a serious doubt about their sincerity, because they are not credible at all. This government is not credible. And I feel very strongly that Netanyahu has is bringing Israel to the precipice of basically a complete moral disaster, moral bankruptcy. That is, Israel today is, in the eyes of the international community, as a country that is unhinged, led by leaders who are unhinged, and all they do, like Trump, like Netanyahu, would like justice, for them to stay in power, come first and foremost, and will take any measure, any time, in order to preserve that their position in power. So we see it here. This is what the American public believe, and that is really unfortunate.
Yeah.
But I want to use, however, your expertise, David, as a foremost psychologist, psychiatrist, who's been living in Israel, I guess, at least 30, 40 years now.
Yes, somewhere around there, yes.
And I'd like our listener would like to understand, shifting of the gear toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The same type of narrative that we're talking about, how Netanyahu and his gang been brainwashing the Israelis about Iran. They've been doing that consistently, going back from the time he was first elected in 1996, sworn to never allow the Palestinians to have a state of their own. And to that end, he's also been engaging in that kind of narrative to persuade the Israelis that, like I said earlier, that the Palestinians pose an existence after Israel if they were to have their own state. I would like you to address this. That is, in just one minute, like Gans recently, just a couple of days ago, as well as Bennett, when we're asked about, prospect of Palestinian state, even those in the opposition still are not even afraid to talk about the prospect of a Palestinian state. Now, I would like you to address this issue from the Israeli perspective. What do they expect to happen if the Palestinians are not going to have a state of their own? What's going to happen?
So let's say here, I think, welcome to ambiguity. I think that that question is parried with great energy by most of the governmental leadership in this country. They don't want to address that question, not so much because they don't want to deal with the question, but they have other things on their agenda that are less obvious. Now, what I mean by this is as follows. I certainly feel that, I certainly agree with you that the Netanyahu government, since Netanyahu has been in power for nearly 20 years, has worked vigorously and energetically against the formation of any kind of Palestinian state. I've asked myself that question, why is this so? And as opposed to the Palestinian state, what is it that the Netanyahu government wants? And here I listen carefully to what they say, and I don't think that they provide satisfactory answers both ways. Certainly when it comes to the Palestinian state, the narrative drifts very quickly and very easily into a security component. That a Palestinian state will be a terrorist nest and will attack Israel, and the Palestinian state will be to Israel what Gaza is to Israel today. And here we again see the strategic manipulation of fear to ensure allegiance to the government point of view. That's how I see that.
Right.
So I think if you're asking a psychological question as well,
yes,
then we have to address the issue of what has been referred to in the literature as the emotional climate. And fear in Israel and the Palestinians is very dominant in the emotional climate. Fear skews the way we process information so as to fit ways and means to reduce the fear rather than enhance it. And I think we need to be aware of the power of fear in the public discourse here in Israel. Let me, however, jump a little bit to the side and look at it perhaps less in psychological terms, more in political terms. And that is that, to me, it is clear, abundantly clear, that if Netanyahu is against the Palestinian state, it is because, not because he says that he wants a greater Israel, he does it. In other words, he speaks through actions rather than words. We see the massive penetration of the settlement project into, and we see the disgraceful, morally disgraceful conflict that takes place between violent settlers and the Palestinian population. To me, it's clear where it's all going. Where it's all going is that that's not the Palestinian state. That's what we want. We, not me personally, but we, the government. That's what we, the government, want. And the Palestinian state, any talk about the Palestinian state would interfere with that. Let me point out something very interesting. That was pointed out a couple of years ago already by a very prominent journalist in Israel, Alon and David, when she said it amazes her that in previous years, the Israel-Palestine conflict was dominant in the discourse in Israel. Today it's disappeared. It's gone. And if you ask why it is gone, I want to tell you what happened in that brief interlude 1 year when the Netanyahu government was voted out and the Bennett government came in. At that time, one senior politician in the center invited the leader of the Palestinians for some sort of conference with him. And I noted that Smotrich was enraged. And what he said, it slipped out, but he made it clear. He said, we have worked for years to remove any discussion of the Israel-Palestine conflict from the public awareness. That was his statement. I'm not saying it was verbatim, but that's the spirit of that statement. And that's telling me an enormous amount. The Israel-Palestine conflict, in the eyes of the dominant political leadership today, is out, and what is in cannot be talked about. And what cannot be talked about is the penetration into greater and greater areas surrounding Israel. The West Bank, Gaza and Lebanon are also included in this kind of discourse, greater Israel. So, and it can't be talked about because Netanyahu, as a skilled manipulator of public opinion and a skilled manipulator of the media, knows that this is a very unpopular discourse, and he doesn't let it come out.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I remember well when this government you mentioned that Bennett and they agreed, as a coalition. Basically, they put the coalition together because they wanted to oppose Netanyahu. They agreed on many and a significant agenda about everything, but they could not agree on what to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so that coalition government decided not to discuss it.
Yes.
Not to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What is it? I ask ourselves, and I ask many Israelis, you saying that a Palestinian state poses existential danger. Ask yourself, nearly 80 years later, is Israel today safer than it was 30 or 40 years ago? Now, I don't think anyone who is honest with himself, any Israeli who can say today Israel is safer than it was 30 or 40 years ago. That is the policy, the strategy of preventing this Palestinian from having a state of their own pretty much has backfired. Because the ultimate question remains today. You have still 7 million plus Palestinians living in the West Bank, Israel proper, and Gaza. versus 7 million Israelis, Jews. So you can annex another acre, another 2, another square mile, another 2. Where are the Palestinians are going to go? What is going to happen? And the problem is why it is not being discussed. There's no in Israeli there's no discourse about it in Israel itself. Is because exactly what you are saying. Remove this from the agenda. It is as if it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. When in fact it is probably the only major issue today that Israel faces. In order for Israel to really feel safe and secure, it's exactly what it takes: establishment of a Palestinian state rather than preventing one from being established. So what you see here, I keep saying the same thing. Remember, 90% of all Palestinians were born after 1967, which means under occupation. 90%. And 80% of all Israelis were born after 1967. So imagine, then 80% were born when the occupation was already in place. So it became normalized, became a very normal thing to live with. So that is why it is an issue they don't want to deal with. They were concerned about what's going to happen in Gaza. The Gaza war, of course, was consuming, and the Israeli public became even more entrenched because of the October 7 attack. But they're still refusing to see the larger picture. Where would you go from here? So I'm asking you as an Israeli living there, what is the path forward? Where do you go from here? Then Smotrich and Ben-Meir said it clearly. We want to annex the West Bank. But they're not saying, okay, where are the Palestinians going to go? So they're talking openly about Greater Israel. It's not a secret. It's not a secret at all. So how do you see this, where that's going to go? If there is still resistance to a Palestinian statehood, there is no clear path how to proceed. No one is thinking about where Israel is going to be 10, 15 years down the line. Where do you see it going yourself, living there and experiencing day in and day out what is happening?
Before I respond, I just want to mention something that you said when you talked about the Palestinian state as an existential threat to Israel. That is the view of Netanyahu and the government, not necessarily the view of the population or of a significant proportion of the population.
But the majority, if I may say, majority of Israelis oppose the establishment of Palestinian state.
Yes.
Absolute majority. Okay.
Yes, at this time. Yes, absolutely. Let me answer. I want to address your comments beginning at a tangent. And that is that, yes, if between the river and the sea, there's approximate parity between Jews and Arabic-speaking people, which may be a Muslim or a Christian, and so on and so forth. I think an important and naive question is, what's the best way for them to live together? I mean, that is a kind of undercutting of the complexity of politics. What's the best way for them to live together? Well, as I see it, given the fact that there is such there's such a historical load that is behind that, and many other things that we all know about, the terrible traumas, the wars, the brutality that has taken place on both sides, I have to say. Israelis and Palestinians have done terrible things to each other over the years. It's a great tragedy. If the question is what is the best way for them to live together, there are really only three solutions. The one is that it should be a one-state democratic solution, which is extraordinarily problematic, and I don't see an easy way out here. It's partition, which at the moment, I'll come back to that in a moment, or an apartheid's Greater Israel. Those two, and the apartheid Greater Israel is involved with some sort of ethnic cleansing. because although it is not too clearly spoken about, it has become spoken about.
But it is in
The
fact a
far right are
reality
talking
today.
about
I
it.
think it's a reality today. Today there is an apartheid in place already.
Yeah,
And
it's
there
already,
is
it's
ongoing
there.
ethnic cleansing
I
both
agree.
in
I
Gaza
agree.
and in the West Bank. So Israel is by everyone around the world now view Israel as an apartheid state. Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, you see, I want to come back to the issue of partition. I certainly think, again, I go back to a more basic statement, and that is, I think that there should be a separation between the Israeli population and the Palestinian population of some kind. I think that speaking of a Palestinian state in the pristine terms of Oslo is no longer realistic. Too much has changed at base. I do believe that what is needed, and which is at this time impossible, what is needed is some form of political process, a low-level political process, perhaps, as an initiating measure, as an ignition, to begin a discourse between two peoples who are disputed or have a chronic, brutal dispute over the same land, the ownership of the land, and ipsi facto also their identities, in as much as each one negates the identity of the other. Under these conditions, you cannot begin with a solution that is fully formed and matured. You have to go back to the beginning
I agree
and
with you.
begin with a political process. Let me just tell you, a friend of mine who's an engineer told me the story of how they live close to the in the area of the West Bank. They live close to one of the major Palestinian cities. He lives in Israel, and they work together as engineers to solve certain obvious problems of water, electricity, sewage, and so on and so forth. And they work together extremely well. That's how talking begins. It can develop from there into a slowly developing political process. And the idea behind it, in my view, is that it should aim towards separation of some kind, given the new realities. So I think the central problem right now is this. On both sides, I think on the Palestinian side as well as on the Israeli side, the leaderships are not suitable for this. Their motivation is different. I often ask myself this question: what does the Israeli leadership and the Palestinian leadership get out of the conflict? Because it's such a chronic conflict. It continues so much forever. Well, I think the answer for the Israeli side is what we've been talking about. It's greater Israel. The conflict is useful because it provides cover for the development of encroachment and penetration into Palestinian space, which is, if there was a right-winger over here, they would attack me vigorously and say it's not theirs at all. So that gives you an idea of the mindsets. On the Palestinian side, it's more complex. I don't know if we want to go into this, but we're dealing with a kind of stasis that prevents the initiation of a political process so desperately needed in two peoples who are in dispute over the same land. They're not even talking.
The only thing, to some extent, I agree with you. To some extent, I have some reservation. When you talk about political process has to have an end game of sort. That is, what is the political process ought to be leading to? That is, you cannot just talk in vacuum. We want to reconcile our differences. You're establishing that kind of political process. I also call it the process of reconciliation. That is, along with the political process, you need to reconcile differences along the way. But you cannot simply talk about political process without establishing an end game. What is going to be the end game? That is, the Palestinian would engage the Israelis in any political process, if they understand that in 5 years and 10 years and whatever that number of years, they will end up having their own entity, their own independent entity. So you cannot have a political process without an end game. So that is necessary. And I agree with you. One said the democracy, it just won't work because the Palestinian in no time will be a majority and Israel will no longer be a Jewish state for that matter. But I also want to go back to the 80s. You remember, Israelis and Palestinians were going back and forth. Israelis used to go to the West Bank, do a lot of shopping, go back to Israel. That is peaceful coexistence. It's not impossible. It existed before. But you need the kind of political framework now to formalize it. That is, I maintain that both sides, you talk about separation. Honestly, you cannot separate. How do you separate? You have settlements throughout the West Bank. You have Palestinians living in Israel, 2.2 million of them. You have Israelis in Gaza now. Israel does not want to relinquish Gaza anymore. So the population is intermingled. There is absolutely no way you can create any kind of physical separation. It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible, which means the political process you're talking about will have to consider the fact that they coexist already. The question is defining the nature of coexistence. That is, there is no possibility of separation, which means they need to agree pretty much on the political separation, political borders, not physical borders. How, for example, Jerusalem. You have 350,000 Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, 300,000 of them. Today, they go back and forth to West Jerusalem freely. No one stops them. Am I right? So
Absolutely.
how do you separate it? So what I'm saying then, I agree that it's got to be a process. The process, however, it will have to be political, that plus reconciliation, that must lead to something that need to be defined. And as long as the Israelis are not prepared to sit down and talk about that kind of process, I would challenge the Palestinian. You say the Palestinians don't want Israel. Well, I would challenge the Palestinian today and say, look, we are ready to sit down and negotiate unconditionally. Come to the negotiating table. Why no Israeli government has done so, and not even the opposition. That is the dilemma we're facing today. So what's your take on that?
Let me put it to you like this. I want to go back. I've just forgotten the name. I want to check. In 2008, an article appeared in Haaretz, written by a dominant professor of political philosophy who's passed away since. Shlomo Avineri, yes.
Shlomo Avineri, of course.
Yes. Now, Shlomo Avineri wrote an article which, for me, constitutes an important key, and that is this. You see, perhaps let me backtrack slightly before I get to this point.
Please.
And that is this: your question about what is the end game? What are we working towards? I feel that has become fogged. It's covered in fog. I think for the first important reason is this, that so much has changed on the ground. How many scholars have examined what would be the contours and the possibilities and the potential to create some sort of Palestinian state today, given the new realities on the ground? If there was something to work towards that, we would have some clarity, but it's fogged over. I don't think we can see it very clearly. I can't see it very clearly. It's fogged, and perhaps that constitutes the success of the Netanyahu narrative, that it has become fogged. And I think that is quite an important point for me. The other question is this. Alon, you and I, over the years, have chatted about this, and I want to bring this to the fore, and that is, with the present leaderships, you cannot expect any progress in this area. There's no possibility of rapprochement. between between the Palestinians and the Israelis, given the present leaderships. The present leaderships, if we're talking again about psychology, a very important factor in psychology, more for industrial psychology and maybe political, is the question of motivation. What is the Netanyahu leadership motivated towards? Whatever they're motivated towards, I can tell you one thing, it is not rapprochement. It is the building up of a power base to control the other side. What is shall we say, the motivation for the Palestinian side? For me, that's even less clear, because I've tried to read and find Palestinian intellectuals who can offer some kind of vision. And I don't find it very clearly. Perhaps you would know. I don't find it very clearly. But what I do find is the rhetoric of the conquering of the land and returning it to the Waqf on the Hamas side, and liberating the land on the Palestinian, the PLO side. That's the rhetoric that, which is understandable for historical reasons, but I don't see in the current discourse, the current narratives that are conflicting with each other, I don't see a clear picture of the goal. And in fact, I sometimes think that the goals, if a political process was to come about because of a change of leadership, which in my view is the sine qua non of any kind of political process, then the goals would have to be emergent properties that come out of a real and effective political process. It is not for me anyway, not clear at this time.
I agree with you. I mean, first of all, I agree that there is, on both sides, a crisis of leadership.
Yes.
There are no leadership on either side. They courageous enough, visionary enough to say enough is enough. We need to change the dynamics in order to settle this once and for all. So you don't have leadership. Tragically, on top of that, in Israel itself, there is no opposition, the opposition parties. Within the opposition, there is also no leaders who have that kind of vision, the Rabin vision, which is enough is enough. So you have that is a crisis of leadership on both sides.
Indeed.
But I want to also mention to you one thing. We have to remember the Palestinian Authority recognized Israel's right to exist. That was going back to the Oslo Accord.
Indeed.
Recognized Israel's right to exist. And Netanyahu, I met with Netanyahu in 1997, briefly. Was arranged for him now. And I asked him that one question. I said, now that there is the Oslo Accord, I take it you're going to build on it in order to find it. He said, God forbid.
Yeah.
I will do everything in my power to dismantle the Oslo Accord, because there'll be no Palestinian state, not now, not ever. That's what he said, going back now, 1997, 29 years ago. 29 years ago. So we have to, had Israel wanted to end that conflict with the Palestinian, after the Palestinians recognized Israel following the Oslo Accord, we could have built something. Israel could have built on that, and potentially that we would have no conflict with the Palestinians today. But that obviously did not happen. So when you talk about how can you fashion a solution given the circumstances, given the reality on the ground, I spend many months thinking about that. And I actually wrote a major work on that. It hasn't published yet. In fact, you can, without necessarily making dramatic shifting of demographic shifting. It is possible. It's the will that is missing. The will on the part of the Israeli government in particular. That is, Israel is the powerful party here, by far. The Palestinian I talk to on a regular basis, they tell me they do not think, not now, not ever, to be able to overwhelm Israel in any way, certainly not militarily. They know what Israel is all about. So if Israel does not take the initiative, the Palestinians simply cannot take that initiative either. It is Israel who is the more powerful that can, in fact, create a condition that make it possible to start what you call the political process.
Yes.
But Israel does not want to take that initiative. And that is what we're faced with today. And given there is no leaders that come to the fore, even after the Hamas's attack, I was in Jordan the day after the attack took place. And at the time I thought this breakdown could eventually lead to a breakthrough, because the Israelis will now recognize there's going to have to be an end to this conflict. After all, I mean, I have to tell you, David, the October 7, however tragic it is, and it is unacceptable, that savagery of Hamas, it cannot be also taken out of context, given that Gaza has been under blockade for nearly 2 decades. And the suffering of the Palestinians has been sustaining both in the West Bank and in Gaza as well. So, we have to put things in a proper perspective. There's no way you can justify the October 7 attack, but it has not taken in vacuum. It did not happen in vacuum. So Netanyahu and his government made the situation considerably worse than it has ever been, and will continue to deteriorate. And again, take it from this point. Now, the war in Iran, against Iran, in my view, had made things even worse. Where do we go from here?
Well, look, the point that you made and the point that I also made, and I think we are in agreement here, is that if there is ever to be hope of rapprochement between the Israeli and the Palestinians, some kind of ability to work together, it will be because there is a change of leadership, which really comes back to a political question. What needs to happen to change the voting patterns in Israel?
Exactly.
And what needs to change in the leadership patterns in the Palestinian sectors? Certainly from the Israeli point of view, what needs to change is a very difficult problem. I'm very interested in the fact that at the time when Palestinian terror in Israel was very dominant, political scientists who studied the data found that was the time of a massive shift to the right in Israeli politics, bringing more and more of what I will term, what is in my opinion, the intransigent right into power, supporting the Netanyahu point of view and creating a greater and greater power base, which they've been very successful at. What would change those voting patterns? I don't know, but the voting patterns need to change. That is the issue here. I cannot see that the Netanyahu leadership will ever become in any way psychological minded and begin to examine themselves and say, what are we doing? Maybe we need to rethink, it's not human. That is not in the mindset of the particular kind of conservative mindset that exists in that government. With regard to the Palestinian picture, the issues there are of a different kind. I mean, reading the charter of Hamas and reading the charter of the PLO is quite an enlightening experience, because the PLO charter, as I see it, is a political document. It is a statement that our lands have been conquered and we need to get our lands back and get our rights back. That's a political statement, a moral and political statement. The Hamas document is a religious document. It defines the land as the Waqf, and that the land is forever, divine. In the Israeli side, that's also crept in, the religious component. And we've discussed this, that and I must tell you, it's very interesting. There's a number of scholars who've been writing about this, who found a correlation. Correlation is not causation, of course, but a clear correlation that the more religious an organization, a violent organization is, the more it is violent and lethal. And we see this on both sides of the picture, and
I absolutely
that's the
agree.
leadership.
Yeah.
If the leadership was to change and become predisposed towards conciliation, then everything that you say and everything that I believe becomes possible. It's not possible now.
I mean, what you mentioned here, it's a critically important, that is the religious component, specifically, even more in Israel even than the Palestinians.
Absolutely.
Religious component. I mean, I just want to mention to you, though, Hamas changed its charter in 2019, basically accepting Israel's right to exist under certain conditions. So they have changed their charter. But the religious component is a big problem today, especially in Israel. And that is something that further obviously complicating the conflict greatly. As long as many Israelis believe this land been being bequeathed to the Jews for eternity by God, and who are we not to follow God, God will, so to speak. I just want to leave the last word to you. So I'm going to ask you a sort of hypothetical question in a way. Suppose, David, you are the Prime Minister of Israel today. What would you do? And that's the last word is yours.
My first step would be to set up a political mechanism which enables dialogue between the two sides. I know from the Oslo period, which was more of a period of hope where dialogue did take place. There was a reduction. This is Bartal has talked about this a lot. There was a reduction in the hostility and lethality of the conflict. Both sides, in my view, sabotaged it. That's a different story. So when people say to me, that's all been done before, why go that same route again? I don't think it's been done before because it was sabotaged on both sides. And I think it hasn't been done to the fullest extent yet. And that would be my first step, is to set up some kind of mechanism enabling dialogue and enabling low-level cooperation. The next step I would do was to mobilize think tanks to begin to reduce the fog around a future vision that is realistic and takes into account the realities that have changed since the Oslo time. And I would deal with that question. What is the best way for 7 million Israelis and 7 million Palestinians? What is the best way for them to live in the space between the river and the sea? That's an evolving question. It's an emergent issue and not necessarily one that should be answered too quickly now.
And that's why you have to run for the Prime Minister, form your own government, own party. David.
Well, you won't find me in party politics. That you
David, we can continue this conversation for hours. I want to thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope to see you soon.
I look forward to that.
I'm due to visit Israel sometime soon.
Good.
So I want to wish you the best, and thank you again for taking the time.
And very much from me too, and thank you for the opportunity, and I've really enjoyed talking with you.
No, the pleasure is mine. Thank you again, David. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode on the issues. You can find this podcast on my SoundCloud page, and stay tuned to my social media accounts for the latest analysis and announcements.